So in the last few satsangs, we focused on some of the different states um, and how we can confuse those states as being the change which is referred to, or which we might think is liberation. And in thinking that the process is about certain changes that we might think are experiential in a sense of a change of state or a change of sense of identity, then when that happens, we might find ourselves even more convinced that that's what the process is about, and actually miss the practical change that I suggest, and what Ramesh suggested, is what the change is really about. So we should ask, in practical terms, what is enlightenment? In other words, in practical terms, what am I seeking? And simply put, I would say we're looking for continuous, unbroken peace of mind. That means we're looking for, well, that's what we should be looking for. That's what's available. So we might not actually be looking for it. We might be looking for a new car and a better circumstance, a soulmate, etc. But what is really available in terms of happiness for the human being is happiness through continuous, unbroken peace of mind. That's what it ends up looking like, feeling like, being. Liberation turns out to be happiness, but not happiness in the form of gaining pleasure or gaining perfect circumstance or gaining a certain state or experience, that many of which can feel exciting and can have qualities that we think we would like all the time. And in fact, if we had that all the time, we'd probably find that that wouldn't satisfy, because that's not the satisfaction that's available for human beings in this life. The contentment, the happiness, is to find ourselves at peace with life, at peace with ourself, meaning the absence of an uncomfortableness with life, the absence of an uncomfortableness with oneself. That's what peace of mind is, the end of psychological suffering. And so if the process is about the ending of psychological suffering in practical terms, we should ask, why is suffering there? What is suffering? And therefore, what changes such that suffering no longer arises? So I think they're good questions. What is suffering? And why does it arise? So suffering in practical terms arises in the form of an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, which when we look at it deeply is actually an uncomfortableness with oneself. That's the generic description. And I think, and that was extremely important in my seeking, is to find a description that really adequately describes, points at the suffering so that it can be registered and picked up whenever it presents itself. It's to feel into the different forms of suffering and see, yes, it's an uncomfortable with oneself, an uncomfortableness with oneself. And that's important, because that then gives us almost like a calibration. We are calibrated to pick it up, because we have an experiential match that has been put into our system. It's an uncomfortableness with oneself. And specifically, that uncomfortableness arises in different forms. And so they're different uncomfortablenesses, different forms of uncomfortableness, but they're all uncomfortable. Not physically uncomfortable, but a sense of uncomfortableness with who I am with my own sense of self. And in practical terms, it's going to arise in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. Guilt for those actions that have happened through me that have delivered pain to myself or to someone that I like, or actions that have got in the way of me getting where I would like to go. And because it has delivered pain to myself or to someone I love, and I see myself as the doer, then there is an attitude towards my functioning, towards myself, an attitude of hatred. I didn't do what I caused myself pain, I caused pain to the other, and that is an attack on my happiness, so I hate myself. That is guilt and shame for essentially having an attitude towards myself as not having lived up to the mark, not being good enough, not being worthy, not being correct or valid is the sense. And that's the uncomfortableness. I don't feel valid because of how I function in life, how I function poorly in life, hurting others, hurting myself, failing at projects. So that's the attitude of guilt and shame. And then we have the same attitude, but towards the other, for actions that have happened through them, which we see as their actions that have delivered pain to myself or someone I like or love. And that pain is seen as an attack on what I need in order to be complete. And so you hurt me, I hate you for hurting me. Not only hurting me painfully, but what I interpret, if the belief in doership and attachment to outcome is there, interpret as being an attack, an interference with my completeness, with where I'm heading, which I believe will deliver this completeness. And pride is the same attitude of personal doership, where I see myself as the doer, the other as the doer. And so pride is the same attitude of personal doership, but in relation to outcomes that are positive. And it's like, look what I have achieved as the doer. Look how good I am. And so we've often, or I'm sure we've all heard the saying, pride comes before the fall. If the attitude of pridefulness is there, arrogance is linked to pride, and it's like, look, I'm the best, look what I've achieved. Life is inevitably going to come along and humble us by producing outcomes that are not ideal, not what we want. That's bound to happen at some point. And if we're there claiming, look how good I am, feeling overconfident and feeling on top of the world because of the outcomes, then when life comes along and delivers an outcome that is not in line with our expectation, then this fall from high perch happens. And in that fall, there's a sense of emptiness. There's a sense of seeing our frailty. If we've built our sense of self up based on outcomes, we then have to feel small because of knowing ourselves only relative to success and failure. So that's the attitude of personal doership towards the actions of the other, the actions of myself, and in terms of negative actions or actions that have delivered pain, then it's shame and blame, or guilt and shame, blame and hatred. And in relation to my attitude, my actions that have delivered positive outcomes, it's the attitude of pride, all based on the belief in personal doership. If we don't see the other as the doer, then we can't blame ourselves or blame the other on the basis that they could have and should have done it differently. And that's what blame is really saying. You could have acted differently. And because the way you acted delivered pain to me, you should have acted differently so as not to deliver that pain. And the same, I could have and should have acted differently given my current actions delivered pain. And so I could have acted differently is our self-image. As the personal doer, we think we're in control of how we act. And if we start to get a glimpse that how we perform in each moment and what the outcome is not a result of my orchestration, that I and the other is not the doer, but rather there is a story of life. This is how it needs to be looked at attitudinally. There is a story of life, and my actions and the other's actions are happening exactly according to that story in order for the story to turn out exactly as it's been created. And so then with that outlook, my attitude on life is sort of an attitude of, oh, so in this moment, this is how life is meant to be. Rather than the attitude of, I need life to be different. It shouldn't be turning out this way. What did you do wrong? What did I do wrong? How are we going to make life turn out the way I want it? That's the attitude of personal doership, thinking that we are the ones creating life. And so there's so much noise that goes on in our head, so much commentary that goes on in our head if we think of life that way, because we're completely immersed then in trying to figure out what's best and what wasn't good and what should have been different. The alternative view is, oh, this is life. It's like really like watching a movie. At the movie, you are interested in seeing what comes next and feeling the experience of what is delivered, what unfolds in the storyline. You're not sitting there commenting on the movie as to whether the script should be this way and whether the lighting should be that way and whether that was the right actor for the job. To the extent that that's what happens in a movie, you essentially aren't able to be one with the movie. You're not able to enjoy and appreciate the movie in the way it was intended. And essentially, that's what's happened in life, is that we are overlaying a commentary about life, commenting as if it could be different, as if our opinion will change it. And what's more important is that that commentary has in it, inherent in it, a resistance to life. It creates the one commentating, the one that feels like it has been impacted personally by life. And that commentary is essentially a resistance to what is happening. And it's uncomfortable. It includes, it pervades, it adds a layer of uncomfortableness on top of the pleasure or pain of the story of life, on top of the pleasure or pain of the way that the circumstance is unfolding. And that uncomfortableness, if it's not seen as an additional layer and an attitudinal layer, meaning it's a commentary about what is happening, it isn't the thing that is happening itself that is the uncomfortable feeling, but rather the commenting, the attitude towards it. And if that isn't seen to be the case, then the uncomfortableness might be felt or interpreted or misinterpreted as being because of the circumstance. It can seem like it is because it's an attitude towards the circumstance, and the circumstance is here in the present moment. The uncomfortableness is here in the present moment, and the attitude can sort of seem transparent. It can seem like it's not there. And so all we really have is the gross circumstance, the the objects in the room, the other person, and the pleasure or pain of the circumstance, and the uncomfortableness. And so it can seem like the uncomfortableness, which really is human unhappiness, it can seem like it's because of the circumstance. And so that's the attitude that is currently in place as part of our makeup. When I say makeup, I mean the human being is essentially impersonal consciousness of source. So impersonal consciousness, which has the characteristic or the faculty of awareness and the ingrained sense of existence. And that impersonal consciousness requires an instrument through which to appreciate life. The way this manifestation has been created is that in order for source to be aware of the manifestation, it needs to function through a portal, function through an instrument that is part of the manifestation level of life. So impersonal consciousness of source, which is sort of prior to the manifestation, need to identify and link to and function through a vehicle, which is what we are. Now, we're not just the vehicle, we are the combination of the vehicle and consciousness functioning through the vehicle. So, when we talk about the impersonal consciousness of source, we might wonder, what is that? Where is it? And when we talk about consciousness of source in the manifestation, we might sort of be looking for it and wondering where it is. And the strange thing is that our experience, the human experience, is the experience of impersonal consciousness of source functioning through this particular body-mind organism. So how close? It's that close. They're not two. The human being and source are not two. Now we have all sorts of problems reconciling that, because we have this idea of source as being something. We attribute certain characteristics to source, like benevolence, let's say, or certain characteristics. And then we look at the expressions of humans, or some humans, or some humans some of the time, or most humans some of the time, some humans all of the time. And we look at their actions and we say, oh, that can't be source, because that person is hateful, or that person is evil, or that person is unpleasant or unkind. And so just a little thought like that says source is love, for example, and then we have our idea of what love is. Very much, humans are prone to project their experience, which might be something very specific to, something very specific to themselves, and maybe common in some forms, common to humans, and then we project that onto source. So a little idea like source is love, and then with our idea of what love is, and see certain functioning and say, well, that can't be source. I can't be source. Or I'd like to be source, but it must be some part of me that I'm not familiar with, because the unpleasant parts of me, that can't be source. It's amazing how a little idea like that can create essentially an image, because without, whether we know it or not, our thinking sort of creates the framework that we have for life. And if that framework includes in it a separation when there is no separation, or includes a labeling of sources, something that then excludes that source, as we've got it in our model, excludes that from being the rest of the manifestation, for example, we have a model that is sort of out of line with what actually is. And so it requires the model, the way we feel life, the way we see life. And so the way we feel life is often very correlated with the way we see life, and vice versa. It's a sort of feedback loop. And so if our model starts to get refined, starts to get tweaked, we might find that a whole view of life that wasn't available starts to open up. And then who knows where that snowballs. How just a shift in how we relate to source can then allow a whole lot of other concepts to fall into place, and a whole lot of other concepts that are causing other problems to fall away. So the human being is impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, and that combination is what I in this teaching will call the human being, or the ego. Right? So I've just said the ego. Now, don't necessarily hear it the way you understand the word ego, because ego is primarily used in other places as something that will die as part of the spiritual seeking process. Like the ego will die before physical death. And in the way that I've just described it, the ego, or the person, is not something that is going to die through this spiritual process, but rather it's what we are. We are impersonal consciousness of source, functioning through, integrate or merged with, and functioning through the body, mind, organism instrument. And as it does that, as it links to a body, mind, organism instrument, it then experiences life as what we can call the personal consciousness experience. So how has impersonal consciousness of source become personal consciousness experience? It's done that because it's plugged into the body, mind, organism, to the biological instrument, a very complex and beautiful organic instrument created by life. When I say beautiful and complex, I don't mean necessarily physically beautiful. We're all beautifully intricate and complex. The human body has got an amazing central processing unit. It's got an amazing system of immunity and defenses that heal. If you ever have a cut, not too deep, hopefully, but not just a scratch. If you have a fairly significant cut that doesn't need stitches, let's say, or it gets stitches, to watch it over days, see how it all fills it all in and regenerates essentially. It's an amazing instrument. It's got built-in repair system, basically. So the biological instrument has an amazing intelligence built into it. And many other aspects of life also exhibit this sort of intelligence. The human instrument is arguably one of the instruments that has the most concentrated form of intricacy and intelligence of most of all of the objects on Earth, let's say. So impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism then functions through that as what we can call personal consciousness, aware of life in each moment, and that we can call our personal consciousness experience. So if the body-mind organism has a short temper and certain circumstances trigger that temper, then anger is going to arise or irritability will arise. And that is part of the personal consciousness experience. If a strawberry is there and it's eaten, then the taste buds and the brain will create the personal consciousness experience, which will include in that moment the taste of strawberries. And when the eyes see something, the information is sent to the processing unit, and that processing unit, amongst other things, can create thoughts and feelings, emotions. So you can see an animal, mother and child, with the mother animal looking after the child, and the eyes can see that. The brain processes the image, and then thoughts or emotions arise. And that is a very personal and subjective and it's what we can call part of the personal consciousness experience. It wouldn't have happened if the body-mind organism was different. If the body-mind organism didn't have eyes, it wouldn't be able to see, and the visual is part of the personal consciousness experience. So essentially, all the way through life, whatever the experience is, it's a personal consciousness experience, an experience happening as a result of consciousness linked to a particular body-mind organism. And even peak experiences that feel very impersonal and sometimes even feel like consciousness isn't functioning through the body-mind organism, we'll find it still is functioning through the body-mind organism, even if the experience seems to be witnessing or seeing the body-mind organism as an object from outside of it. Still, I will assert that the concept I put forward is that is still consciousness functioning through the body-mind organism, and it's very simple to reconcile that for yourself. If you have one of those out-of-body experiences, just cover the eyes and you'll see that the image of the world will change, and demonstrate that the consciousness is still using the vehicle, the biological instrument, to sense the experience, which we can call a personal consciousness experience. Even though the sense of being a person or an individual can fade away, and the sense is what I am is not a form object, and I don't have age and I don't have gender. That, I would say, is a very personal version of a personal consciousness experience. So the impersonal version of personal consciousness. So let's say you have personal consciousness, and there's a scale of that goes from, on the impersonal consciousness scale, you can go from impersonal all the way up to very personal. And even the impersonal is part of the personal consciousness experience. And it can change, it can come and go. You might find yourself dominantly feeling always very, very personal, or have an experience of life that is quite impersonal. Now, liberation isn't about being in the impersonal sense. What it is, it's about not taking life personally. But not taking life personally is not about feeling that you are not the person. I would say it's about understanding that you are the person that has these different capacities of experiencing life differently. Person feeling like it's very feeling like the experience is a personal experience of being a human being, or feeling like the experience is an impersonal experience of being formless awareness, for example. However, that's not really what's important. What's important is the attitude towards what is going on in the circumstance. And if the attitude is, I am the person, but I'm not the one that is making life happen. I'm not the one that is dictating how life turns out, and the other isn't the one that is dictating how life turns out. And if that attitude to life is deeply, deeply ingrained, which means not some attitude to just positive or negative thinking or an attitude on a thought level, but rather an attitude that arises as either the presence of uncomfortableness or the absence of it. So if the absence of uncomfortableness doesn't arise, if uncomfortableness doesn't arise, meaning the absence of uncomfortableness, then we can say, oh, there must be a deeply ingrained attitude that doesn't take life personally. Because the attitude of taking life personally just isn't arising. And so when that's the case, we realize this isn't about justifying things and saying to oneself, oh, that's very unfortunate, but it's not personal. I'm not the doer. The other isn't the doer. It's much deeper than that. It's much more fundamental and inherent. It's just the way we find ourselves being in life, where someone will say, well, how come you're not thinking about that? And you just go, well, I don't know. It's just the thinking is not happening. So then you will say, it just doesn't seem to be an issue. Because the thinking about it, the resisting it, isn't happening. So that hopefully gives us a sense that what is being spoken about is a very fundamental rewiring of, we can say, our sense of self on a very deep level, not just intellectual. Now, it is part of our intellect, but not part of conscious intellect. It's part of the intellect that we probably wouldn't refer to as the intellect. I'm just saying it's part of the intellect. Technically, it's part of the intellect, but it's the intellect on a very deep level where we don't even need to think about it. Now, what seems to have been put in place in life is the attitude towards life that does take it personally, that does see myself and feel myself to be a separate, independent, autonomous being with volition. And what that really means when we think about it, so you have to go to your experience and say, yes, I feel like I am a separate, independent, autonomous being that can think whatever I like in the next moment. However, if someone asks you, what's your next thought going to be, you have to hopefully admit, I don't know until it happens. But anyway, we often feel like I'm this autonomous entity that can choose how I act and how I feel and how I think. And what that really means is that I am not connected to life. We might not have given it much thought, but if we do, if we're autonomous and in control of all of the bodily functions, that means I am that, and I'm not influenced by anything else. I'm completely independent. And so we must have an idea of what this I that is completely independent is. It must be in some insulated capsule, never exposed to life. And that has to be some conceptual, mistaken idea about who we are, because what is actually happening is that the biological instrument has been created by life. The sperm and egg come together and the genetic blueprint forms, and then the organism grows following the blueprint in that genetic code, and it turns into a little baby. And the baby is continually interacting with its environment, taking in the embryonic fluids before it's born. When it's born, breathing in the air and receiving in all the imagery, being exposed to the environment, being hot or cold, being close to the mother and father, sharing in the energetic exchange between the mother and the father, then growing up in a household, being exposed to certain language and certain cultural behaviors, specific behaviors to that specific set of parents, and then going off to school, being influenced by the teaching principles of that place that they were born into, which they had no control over, being exposed to schoolmates and making friends with kids that they had no control over who was going to be there and who they would bond with, and growing up in a political system, in a cultural system, in a religious system, all of which is bombarding the child with conditioning. And that conditioning becomes one with the biological organism. And so what we are in each moment is a result, is a combination of the gene and the conditioning. They've never been two separate factors. We can talk about them as two factors because we create concepts about the genes being the blueprint, the hardware, and the conditioning being sort of the programming, the software. The truth is that the two never actually exist independent of each other. And because life is delivering new conditioning moment after moment after moment, then we can say, and that the biological organism is growing moment after moment after moment, that we're never the same. There is Heraclitus, or Heraclitus, says, expect the unexpected. It's one of his core tenets. Expect the unexpected in life, meaning you can never be sure what's coming because there's so many variables that are always moving that nothing is ever predictable and nothing is ever constant. Change is the nature of life. And so as a subset of expect the unexpected, which is pointing at change, he says you can never step into the same river twice. And, you know, when we take life on a very macro level, we might sort of think, and literally, we might miss what these pointers are saying. You can never step into the same river twice. And, you know, if you live in the UK, you've got the Thames, it's this big river, the Thames, and you say, I step into the Thames every week, and it's always the Thames. And so clearly what he's saying is the movement, the water is always in movement. The banks are changing, the sand is moving, there are different objects in the river, and it's never the same river ever for a milli moment. It's always new. And the person that is stepping into what might seem like the same river is not the same person. We're changing every moment, millisecond by millisecond. And so when we look at life only on the macro level, we miss what is very important mechanisms and dynamics. And so we end up forming conclusions based on a very surface investigation of life. Another little saying is from Mr. Carnegie in a book, How to Make Friends and Influence People, which is was very well regarded in the early 1900s, I think, 1920 or something. He was around, and one of the chapters is You can never win an argument. And if we look at it literally, and on the surface, you say, well, obviously you get into an argument and you either win or you lose. And so he's got a point the point he's making is that even if you win an argument, you've lost on some level because you've made an enemy of the other person by making them the loser, essentially. And so, yes, on one level, you have won the argument if you get it right, for example, and they were wrong. But so we need to look into the nuances of what is being pointed at in these points. So the human being is always according to design, the genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that what we are, the human being, has never been in control of. We don't know what we're going to find in life next, what the new conditioning is going to be. We're not in control of the genetic structure and how the body grows in life. And we function exactly according to the genes and up-to-date conditioning. At least we can say that the biological functioning and the psychological functioning is a result of these two factors we've never had any control over. No third factor other than genes and up-to-date conditioning. So any thought that you have about whether something is nice or it's not nice, how to address a problem, how you feel in the moment about a certain food, whether you like it or you don't like it, whether you feel tired or you feel hungry, whether you feel a burst of love or a burst of anger, or whether your preference is towards working with your hands or working in an office, all of those things, everything that we might consider my functioning in life is a happening according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, according to our makeup in that moment. And our attitude is an attitude that says, no, I am the one orchestrating, in control of how I speak, what I say, whether what I say is intelligent or not, whether how I treat the other is pleasant or unpleasant, how the other treats me is pleasant or unpleasant. All of that we attribute personal doership over. And that personal doership is an attitude to what happens. Speaking is happening as part of the movement of life, God's will unfolding. And the attitude of personal doership says, no, that's my will. My will as a doer, as a separate independent entity, says, no one made me say that. I said it because that's what I chose to say. And this says, well, you said it, the saying happened because of your specific makeup in that moment and the specifics of the environment you found yourself. And the two of those things came together and a response or a reaction happened. And we're not talking about whether you have an automatic, spontaneous, impulsive reaction, or whether you are able to be considered and think slowly and rationally about it, and then have a response to a situation. Whether you have a reaction or a response is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So there's not a distinction about between responding to life by giving it conscious thought, or whether you are driven to spontaneously react to life. There are two different ways of that we can function in a moment, and either one is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So Ramesh used to say, imagine 4 friends in a taxi in Mumbai, and the taxi stops at some lights on the street, and it's swamped by 15 beggars. And one of the people of the 4 friends is curious about what's happening. Another one is afraid. Another one gets angry. And another one has a feeling of compassion arising. And so They're just 4 different biological or psychological responses that arise based on the specific genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance that the 4 people found themselves in. So the same circumstance, 4 different biological or psychological responses based entirely on their makeup in that moment. In a week's time, one of the people might find themselves in the same situation and find themselves responding differently. Maybe because they saw themselves getting angry the week before and felt there was something off with that, and they gave it much thought, and they went through a process of putting themselves in the shoes of the beggar, and maybe there was insight that says, wow, if I was in the beggar's position, this makes sense. This is part of their survival. This is what they have to do and so my anger towards it might not be what will always be there. So the person went through a thinking process, and that thinking is effectively new conditioning arising in that moment. Their own contemplation about the situation can be classified as new conditioning. And so a week later, they find themselves in a similar situation, and there's going to be a reaction now or a response. And whatever it is, whether they get angry again or whether they look at it and find compassion arising, it doesn't matter. It's not about becoming a better human being. It's not about saying, I need to move from being angry, finding anger arising, to finding compassion arising. The point is to see that anger will arise or compassion will arise. And whichever it is, it's because of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, which are the same. Sometimes the genes and up-to-date conditioning can remain somewhat constant in some areas, but overall, it's always in flux. And so it makes sense that the anger may persist in those situations for the rest of their life, even after having that contemplation. The contemplation may not penetrate down to a point where it changes the biological or psychological reaction, or it changes. The point definitely not saying that it needs to change from anger to compassion. That is part of one's destiny, part of the pleasure and pain, and or, depending on whether it's just a biological anger or whether it's psychological, and or peace or suffering. So if it's biological anger, then it's just pleasure or pain. And anger, biological anger, is pain, not pleasure. If it turns into blame and hatred towards the action, then it's not only biological anger, but added on, or there's an added load of blame, which is a psychological uncomfortableness with oneself and the other. But even when we think we're uncomfortable with the other, really it's an uncomfortableness with ourselves. And the other half of human suffering is worry and anxiety and expectation and attachment to outcome. And both of those forms of suffering arise because of an attachment to outcomes. An attachment to outcome is a specific attitude to the pleasure or pain in life. Not the person who looks at the pleasure or pain in life, the circumstance, and says, you did this, you should have done it differently. The attachment to outcome is, this is pleasure or pain, and there is a way of relating to pleasure or pain that says that is what diminishes me or completes me. So it is an attitude, a way of relating, an investment in pleasure or pain that sees it as essentially my lifeblood, my solution, my salvation. So really that is feeding into our sense of self, our psychological self-image. The doer we can call it, if we want a name for it. That is the doer with attachment to outcome. And it's a psychological identity. It's all based on a set of beliefs about who I am, who the other is, what life is, and what I need in order to be complete. And the good news is that the attitude of doership, of personal doership, and the attitude of attachment to outcome is all completely off the mark. It's all a misunderstanding about oneself and life. And all of our human suffering arises because life has inserted this psychological false sense of self, this psychological identity that is based on a misinterpretation of life. That's why I say it's a false sense of self. It's a sense of self that has been constructed based on an erroneous understanding of oneself and life. And of course, if that is a construction, a mental structure that forms, it can dissolve. And when it dissolves, we find that I am still here. The human being is still here. And so we can conclude, and the description is that beneath the false sense of self, there is our true identity, our true being that has always been there. Even when the false sense of self was there, we are that which we can come to know ourselves as. So we were that, but the false sense of self essentially created a veil, a distraction that prevented us from knowing ourselves truly. And so for as long as that's there, life is experienced through that psychological identity. And what is forced to be generated when life is experienced through the psychological identity is suffering, guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. The worry and anxiety is a story, a narration that can feel in its intense form as a body sensation of fear and worry. And if you dive into the body sensation or the fear, there'll be a narrative there, which is really the thought-based story that says what I am is something that will be attacked by this negative outcome that I'm sure is going to happen, or at very least is possibly going to happen in the future. So that is the narrative in the worry and anxiety, and it can plague your whole movement through life. And it isn't a conscious thinking, it's just sort of there. And we might try to escape it. And when we try to escape it, what we find is I can't escape who I am. And furthermore, it's an uncomfortableness with who I am, because life seems to be a continuous threat on who I am. So there's an uncomfortableness with life, which really is this uncomfortableness with oneself. And expectation is an interesting one, because we can have an expectation, which is our sort of hopeful outlook of how things will turn out. But if there's an investment in it that says, when life turns out that way, then that's when everything will be okay. That's when I'll feel like I can finally relax and enjoy life. And so that expectation is not something that pops up, once a week for 10 minutes. It tends to be a narrative that we are looking through on a continuous basis. We're churning over the same idea, the same hope, the same idea of how life will look in the future when I make it look like that. And in that idea, we say, and that's when I will feel happy and life will be okay, and when I can stop and smell the roses. And the unfortunate thing about expectation is And it's funny, it doesn't necessarily feel like a very heavy form of suffering. It probably is one of the um, least intense forms of suffering, a bit like pride. Pride can actually feel positive, and expectation can seem like it's positive because we have usually a positive expectation about how our business will develop, or how our family will develop, or how the next year will go, and what we're going to do on holiday. And so it can feel like it's nice to think about that because we're imagining pleasure. However, what we don't realize until we start feeling that thinking and appreciating that it's covering up something fairly significant, something very valuable, what we don't appreciate is that it actually is uncomfortable in its essence, even if we might think it's pleasurable. Or it might be, it might be appreciating what I am prior to or without that psychological self-image. And what it's creating is a whole lot of noise that is looking into the future, and it's creating a sense of the present is not adequate, but that's okay. We don't need to worry about the present because the future will be okay. And what tends to happen is that outlook will continue to push itself further into the future, even if circumstance turns out the way we have expected. We find that, it doesn't deliver what we think it would deliver. And we just extend that attitude of expectation further on into the future, thinking that it's now about something else, that when we get that, then life will be okay. Then I can stop and smell the roses. And the same with blame and resentment, where you just have a feeling of wanting revenge from someone, or arguing in your head about something that is a topic between you and a particular person, maybe something that happened 20 years ago, and you're there feeling about that event and still trying to justify in your head and create an argument that makes the other person wrong, and etc. And in its intense form, it's just this hatred. And then there's shame, insecurity, lack of self-worth, sense of abandonment, despair. All of that is under the category of guilt. And in its intense form, it's like, I am not good enough. And so these are essentially psychological movements that pervade the life experience, sort of like a perfume, but not a very good one, like a dark cloud that makes life seem like it's the problem. And it makes it seem like the circumstance of life is the problem. And with a certain attitude, we're always going to be looking at the circumstance, judging it as not good enough, trying to find the things that we need to be different. And it can seem very altruistic. It can seem like my judgment is for the best of humanity. Don't let that fool you. That's just a way that the psychological identity supports itself from and justifies that mental movement about life. And it will look into all sorts of corners of life to find a problem with life, because very often there actually isn't a problem in your very space where you are right now. So if you're in a park with the ducks and the trees and the blue sky and the sun shining, there really isn't a problem. And yet the mind is going to be finding some resource, its imagination, its idea of the world being a very big place over there with many people, of which many of them are not good, and political systems that are self-serving and corrupt, which is not necessarily what the system is like in its entirety. There might be pockets of that, and psychology makes it black and white and says that it's all completely corrupt, which just can't be the case, because there are so many balancing powers in the structures that are here. That doesn't mean that it's not there, but it can't be completely corrupt. It just wouldn't be acceptable to people if it was as corrupt as our psychology says it is. Anyway, we are sitting in the park, and our attitude towards life creates this heaviness, this uncomfortableness. And that's how humanity has evolved up to this point in time. There are examples of humans transforming in ways where suffering comes to an end, where there is this very clear realization that the uncomfortableness that we experience about ourselves and about life is not because of the life we live in. The extreme examples of this that are there to basically jolt us into realizing it's not about circumstances, where you have people in situations like death camps that were facing the most extreme assault on their physical manifestation, and realizing, connecting to a part of themselves and a part of life where none of that was as much as an attack on who we are as it seems. That don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that doesn't make that an atrocious situation. The fact is that humans and humanity have the capacity and have exhibited extreme cruelty and unkindness in history. I think we're getting better. We're far from there. In fact, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which is sometimes referred to in other teachings as the egoic movement, is to an extent intensifying. And at the same time, there are balancing powers. There is sort of our consciousness on a moral consciousness is evolving in pockets. And personally, I would rather be alive today than 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. I'm not saying it's perfect at all, but the attitude can be an attitude that doesn't look at today and compare it to then, and doesn't look at today and compare it to some ideal, but says, how am I right now in life? And if the psychological identity is there, we say, well, if I think about it, it could be better in this regard and that regard. But in practice, we find, I'm at peace and at ease with, if your heating or your air conditioning doesn't work so well. If you're at peace, you're okay with that. And someone will come in and say, your heating's not working very well. And you go, well, yes, I'm the, and they, how can you live with it? And you go, well, I don't know. It's sort of, that's what it is. And as soon as I have the means to fix it, then I'll fix it, because I can appreciate that the heating being fixed is something very, very pleasurable and very welcome if it's available. But I just find that, that's my lot in life, and I've got, it's not something I'm always feeling uncomfortable about. So the fact that throughout history, humans have been waking up to what is prior to, or what is there, how we can know ourselves when the psychological identity collapses, is an indication that this movement is our birthright. This movement is a capacity of the human being with its intelligence to move beyond its current configuration. And it's testament to the fact that life will set up the or can deliver the conditioning that is required to bring about the changes. And if it happens for someone, we might say, well, life set up the conditions for them. But one of the large conditions is receiving the information. And one of the movements that happens when the human configuration changes is that there is a wish for everyone else to have the same opportunity to experience life the same way. And so therefore the information is passed on. It's shared. And so that's how life ends up delivering the information, which is one of the most significant factors that's needed, is the new conditioning in life. That is conditioning coming from the alternate perspective of oneself, the alternative knowing of oneself. And so the pointers that are delivered, the information that is delivered, is information that has been deemed to be appropriate to assist with the changes. And so that's the basis on which I say it's our birthright to experience life free of suffering. Now, that doesn't mean everyone is going to enjoy their birthright as their experience in life, but it means there's no reason to doubt that it's available for any seeker that finds themselves seeking. No one has been born missing anything needed. Like if you were born with only one leg, then you can say it's not your birthright to run in the Olympic Games and against able-bodied and win the 100-meter sprint. You were born missing something that is needed to win the able-bodied 100-meter Olympic sprint. So you can say it's not your birthright to win that. Whereas when it comes to liberation, the human being isn't missing anything. In fact, if consciousness is functioning through the body-mind organism, then that is the element that is required in order for this peace to be there. So we all have that. So that should be something encouraging. That is something that is part of the concepts that are put forward to inspire and to help bring about the required change. So in life, we find ourselves in a particular situation, and we find ourselves having to make decisions in a situation, and that's how life unfolds. So the way that the predetermined story of life unfolds is through each of us in each moment, finding ourselves in a situation which is by default destiny, part of the predetermined story of life unfolding. And in that situation, we are faced with options. Do I turn right or do I turn left? And a decision needs to be made. And so that is how life has had to unfold from the beginning of time. Since humans came into existence, the caveman found themselves in their cave, and there's a tiger pacing back and forth. This is an example Ramesh used to use. The tiger pacing back and forth, and the caveman's there deciding, do I go out to get food and try and get past the tiger, or do I stay in the cave where I'm somewhat protected? So you're faced with a circumstance and a decision needs to be made. And the way that the story unfolds is through that decision happening. Now, that decision is a movement that happens through a particular body-mind organism, but based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in. So the decision is also part of the predetermined story of life. And yet it requires the human being to make the decision based on their predispositions. So really, on the one hand, we can say, I make a decision, but it was not my decision. There were options and a choice was made, but we have to look at the word choice, not in the way that we historically look at it. Historically, we said, I am the doer. I am a separate independent entity, and therefore the choice is my choice. This way we see I am an instrument through which life is functioning, and life is moving me, my life is living me according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning for a set of options to exist in the moment, and for at some point a decision to be made, which is just the functioning of this body-mind organism. So we can't deny that options exist. Options are contemplated according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is also God's will, or the predetermined story of life unfolding exactly as it's destined, including all the thoughts that arise as part of the decision-making process. And at a particular point, one of the options is picked based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it's not personal, although it's happening through this person. So decisions do get made. Options present themselves as part of the circumstance. Decision gets made and specific actions happen. And that's how life unfolds. And all of that we can say is God's will unfolding. And in practice, in the moment, we say God's will unfolds through the human being doing exactly what they think or feel to do in the moment. Now we might say, well, I'm not doing exactly what I think or feel to do, because what I think or feel to do is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Yes, that's true. That's what we need to see. That's part of what changes our attitude of personal doership. Yet we can't deny that that impersonal movement based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that we weren't in control of, the two factors we were not in control of, manifests through, in the moment, the human being having a thought that says you could go left, and then another thought that says you could go right, and then a thought says I want to go to the right. So in the moment, do exactly what you think, feel. Your intuition might come up and say, actually, don't go left or right, turn back. And so your intuition is part of what you feel like doing. Or you get to left or right and you say, oh, I'm so tired, I'm going to turn back. Actually, I'm not going to finish the trek. So in practice, you are free to do exactly what you think or feel to do, understanding that what you think or feel to do is dictated by your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So this might seem like it's a moot point, and in a way it is. Ramesh would say, you have free will in the moment, but that free will, both in theory and in practice, is worthless, because in theory, what you choose is not in your control. And once you've chosen it, the outcome, sometimes you get what you want, sometimes you don't get what you want, and sometimes you get much more than what you want. And that outcome, whatever it is not in your control. So your free will is essentially worthless. I say that the free will, the feeling of free will, is a gift. And I don't think Ramesh would disagree. What he was saying is that we need to hold the entirety of life, which includes seeing the micro details that allows us to see what's happening beneath the surface. And at the same time, let's not overlook the actual experience by having a theory that says, I have no choice. Because in practice, he says, the choice that is God's will essentially feels like your choice, which is why I say it's a gift. It's a gift because you don't feel like a slave. You don't feel like you are being dictated to by God that is forcing you to do something you don't want. The beauty of this is that God's will and your will, from this perspective, you can see are not two. That God's will unfolds by your will presenting itself in each moment. And understand that your will is not the will of a separate, independent doer, but rather the will of a conditioned instrument, conditioned by life, designed by life, functioning according to life. That's the paradox, and that's how we get to continue to live life as a doer with the feeling of free will, but with the attitude that means the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has been completely annihilated. So what do we have after liberation that we didn't have before? Before, there was an ego, a person, with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, meaning a person with the sense of personal doership. After liberation, there is still the ego. Ramesh was an ego, Ramana was the ego, Peter is an ego. But after liberation, there is an ego, a person, where the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has completely been annihilated. And that person, therefore, knows that they are connected to Source, that what they are is an expression of Source, an expression of life. And in each moment, if speaking is happening, that is Source functioning through them. They know that speaking can't happen unless they are part of life, unless they are connected to life, which then means that that ego, that person, understands that they have never been separate from life, that the other is never separate from life. The other is not the doer, that we are all brothers and sisters in life together as actors or characters in life, all playing our role, all doing exactly what we're destined to do, all functioning exactly according to God's will in order to deliver exactly the amount of pleasure or pain that each of us are destined to have in life. And with this attitude to life, we can see the other not as our enemy or our competitor or our rival, which is what we see the other as when the belief in personal doership is there, but rather we see them as our brother and sister, as instruments through which life is functioning. And if the other acts in a certain way that delivers pain, we can see that they were just the instrument through which the pain that I was destined to receive as part of my destined story of life, where exactly the amount of pleasure or pain that I'm going to receive in my life is already decided. And I can see that the other is just the instrument through which that pleasure or pain is delivered. And so with this attitude, no need to hate the other. Still, the pain of the circumstance is going to be felt on the biological level. If the psychological identity dissolves, we still have the biological instrument that will experience the physical pleasure and pain, the financial pleasure and pain, and the emotional pleasure and pain of life and interhuman relationship. But the added load of guilt and blame that we've carried around for our whole life, that was held together by the belief and rested on the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, can fall away in an instant. And so these concepts are not meant to be taken as but rather they are concepts that are pointing to the way life, the mechanisms of life. They are describing aspects of life, like the flow of life is always only either pleasure or pain, meaning the circumstance is always pleasure or pain. It's not in our control. The reactions in the body are going to be what we can call biological reactions. And if they're stemming from the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, then they are the psychological reactions of suffering. And the biological reaction and the psychological reactions are just part of destiny unfolding. So that's a description. Now, those descriptions, those concepts, are there to point you in a direction where you can investigate this for yourself in your own daily life experience. You don't need to wait for a certain hour of the day to do this investigation. You can investigate it, or rather, investigation will happen because the concepts have become part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning while you're driving the car. Someone will cut you off. That's circumstance. It's pain in the moment, right? You don't want to get a fright and almost have an accident, and yet that happened. And you can see that circumstance, pain in the moment. You might see fright arise. You might see anger arise towards the other. And then the thought might say the fright is a biological reaction. The anger may also be a biological reaction, or it may be blame towards the other as the doer that shouldn't have done that, that shouldn't have delivered that painful circumstance into your life. And blame towards the other, where there is a psychological story, a narrative that is creating an uncomfortableness towards the other, an uncomfortableness beyond the biological anger, but now one of psychological blame that can get carried on for hours or days or weeks. In obviously, probably not because of someone cutting you off on the street, but in terms of relationships breaking down or someone dying, there can be a attitude of doership and attachment to an outcome that lasts a whole lifetime. Parental relationships between parents and children can ingrain a blame and a hatred or a shame that can persist for one's whole life. So as this is investigated, as investigation happens, because the descriptions are not, and even the suggestion that the descriptions be used as pointers, that's not asking a doer to do that. It's not saying you now need to take the descriptions and see where they're pointing, but rather it's, even if the wording sometimes sounds like a prescription for you to do, what it's really saying is, if the concepts which are new delivered and their new conditioning in life, if they become part of your up-to-date conditioning, which is really the cumulative effect of the moment after moment new conditioning in your life, if it becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, then the investigation will happen automatically when someone cuts you off and anger arises, and the thought will arise saying something like, that's pain in the moment. This is a biological reaction of anger, also pain in the moment. And then we might see, and there's the psychological blame that is treating in the narrative the other as a separate independent doer that could have done it differently, instead of seeing that as my destiny, God's will. And even if that person ends up forcing you to bump into them and there's an accident, minor or major, this attitude of doership is something that can kick in even in an extreme situation, and understand this is destiny unfolding. And destiny unfolding will include the pleasure and pain of the circumstance. So you might end up with an injured body in the accident and be in an ambulance with a broken arm, and it's in pain. And so the pain is going to be there. But depending on the attitude will depend on whether there is this extra load, which is actually much more significant than the pain in terms of whether it is acceptable or not. The pain we find we can probably deal with if the psychological uncomfortable and lack of acceptance is there. So if the attitude of hatred towards the other, if the attitude of attachment to outcome, which is imagining that life could have been different, isn't there, then we find ourselves at peace, even being in the ambulance with a broken arm, understanding this is life unfolding. This is what happens in life, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Now, it could be really unfortunate. Let's say your passenger is badly injured, someone you love, and you are badly injured. I mean, the circumstance is not at all pleasant. It's going to create emotional pain. The question is, what is the accompanying attitude? Now, that's not something I'm not suggesting. Please don't create the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. I'm not saying that. You can't, we can't, we're not the doers. That will either be there or it won't be there. But you can see that even in an extreme situation, if the attitude of doership is there, there's this resistance on a psychological level and a blaming the other, a hating the other. And if it's not there, none of that is there. And the biological pain, the emotional pain, the physical pain will be there, but without that other load on top of it. And it's the other load that is in practice, actually, when that other load falls away, we'll find that really that was the problem in life. Our thinking mind will think about the circumstance that I'm pointing at and say, no, it can't be. That is such unfortunate circumstance. It's going to be create suffering. And when the suffering actually falls away, we realize that it's the suffering in life that causes the problem. So hopefully the understanding starts going deeper and deeper and deeper, which means we start seeing the concepts arising and seeing aspects that are pointed in the teaching and seeing, oh, that's pleasure in the moment, that's pain in the moment, that's blame, that's shame, that's expectation. And maybe when the suffering is there, we might remember I am, which is to say, actually I exist in this moment. And the circumstance is not an attack on the essence of who I am. That's where we can drop back into, to know that's while the suffering is still prone to arise, the thought I am can be a reminder that circumstance is not an attack on who you are. That circumstance is not an attack on your peace of mind. As long as you find yourself withdrawing, not as a doing, but if you find a cutting off of the suffering happening and a dropping into being and a dropping into the presence of the moment where you know I exist in this moment, even given the circumstance. That's when we find that there is peace in the essence of the human being, even in the face of unfortunate circumstance. So that's what the narrations from people who have found themselves in extreme situations and say, there's this profound sense that I am existing despite of the circumstance, that I exist in completeness despite of the circumstance. That's there to hopefully combat the thinking mind that says, no, it is about circumstance. So as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, it starts to uproot the deeply ingrained misunderstanding, the deeply ingrained loads of guilt and shame and blame and hatred that have been in the system for years, if not lifetimes, because we don't really understand how unresolved energies can maybe move through the genetic material or the structure of the universe. And so these attitudes of attachment and doership can be seen as not my doing because they can come from situations that we weren't in control of, situations that might not even have been a situation that Roger was in. And it's just a psychology that is in place and forced to function until life starts dissolving it. So as the understanding goes deeper and deeper, it uproots the deeply ingrained misunderstanding. And as that happens, we can start to see life much more as a happening. And we might have this flash of insight one day when thoughts are seen to be not my doing, when emotions are not my doing, when insights are seen to be a happening and not my doing. And we might have this insight, I simply cannot be the doer. Which means the other can't be the doer either. And that's when the load of guilt and blame can fall away. And how it falls away can be with a release of energy in the system. The body is an energetic system, and our beliefs are a large part of that energetic system. A belief has a lot of energetic power in it, and these beliefs of doership and attachment have particularly intense energetic loads. And so as the system starts being cleared out and beliefs start dissolving, we can start to feel energetic shifts in the body, and energetic loads can be released in a cathartic way, or it can happen in our sleep through dreams. There's all sorts of ways that the system rewires itself and cleans out those energies. And as that happens, we find that we turn up in life differently. We don't know why it happened. It's not because we're actively now thinking positively or able to rationalize situations. We just find I feel different. I turn up in life, and certain responses or reactions, certain heavinesses that used to be there are not there anymore. That there's an openness, there's a spaciousness, there's a silence, there's a stillness, which really all is pointing to the absence of suffering, which is suffering is the opposite of stillness. It's the opposite of silence. It's the opposite of spaciousness and openness. It's contracted, it's noisy, it's uncomfortable. So there's no reason to be pessimistic, even though the process isn't in our control. The fact is, if life is living you in a way that you're listening to satsang regularly, you find that the concepts are arising and an investigation for yourself is happening, then the opposite, actually, no need to be pessimistic. In fact, we can feel optimistic. That Ramesh used to say, you can look at yourself as one of God's favorites. Now, I know in the seeking process, there's some very uncomfortable times and you go, I'm hardly God's favorite. However, at other times, when you look back and you see the changes that are happening and you see what the alternative is, where you're living life completely oblivious to the fact that living life through a false sense of self, then we can say, oh, I see, it's all worth it. So let's see if there's any questions, and then we wrap it up for today. Hello. I think you're on, Frank.
Okay. Hey, Roger. How are you?
Hello. Very good.
Good to see you. I don't think I've missed one single one of these talks, so I want to thank you for that. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get this question out. I'm not feeling very articulate today, but I want to do my best. So we once had a short conversation on this call about morality and how that plays into to your teachings, because we talked about me like doing the fourth step for another program, and I was thinking about that today as you were talking about how it's not about being a good person. I don't know if these are the exact words you used, but you said something about it's not really about being a good person or a bad person. It's can you talk a little bit more about that? How does that work when you do away with the sense of doership? Does somebody sort of like tend to fall more in line with what we call morality? Because I know morality is a very big term. Let's say somebody tends to be vindictive, and they go out. I'll own that to myself. I sometimes get vindictive, and I think to myself, it would be a lot easier for me if I wasn't vindictive because I could let things go. So can you talk about this whole thing about morality and that kind of thing? Thanks.
Yes. It's a little bit of a loaded topic, and there's some paradox in it, and it's sort of like there's a little the problem with talking about it is that it can there's a certain point in saying it's not about being a better person, right? There's a reason for saying that. And that's the words that I used. It's not about being a better person, because we can approach the spiritual journey with the attachment to outcome. If that's what's coming through our seeking, the attachment to outcome really is about circumstance, trying to improve circumstance. And if we think it's about making ourselves a better person, then essentially we're looking at changing our biological reactions, where we are, I don't know, healthier, where we are stronger, where we're better looking, whether we're smarter, whether we're kinder, whether we're more financially successful, whether we have more business acumen, trying to look at anger management. So there's a lot of personal characteristics that we can say it would be much better, nicer for myself and for the other if I was more perfect, if I had more good points and less bad points. So if we approach spirituality with the idea that it's about becoming a saint, which essentially means becoming perfect and delivering only pleasure and being, a model person, essentially we're probably still attached to outcomes and not looking at what is really available to the human being as human happiness. And so that's why it's pointed out, this really isn't about becoming a better person, rather about our attitude towards how we function in each moment and how the other functions in each moment. And so that's a very important point. And because it's a very important point, that tends to be emphasized. It's about our attitude to the circumstance. And then this is where it gets a bit contentious, because in history, there's plenty of examples of teachers and sages, or some people would say, well, so-called sages, who find themselves in a circumstance, deliver pain to the other, or function in a way that society or some people in society say is unacceptable, is immoral, shouldn't be that way, and then get sort of questioned by the seekers or by so-and-so and say, you can't say that you're liberated and this, and then still function in these immoral ways. This is where it starts to get a bit tricky, because the question is, what is the understanding and what effect does it have on a human being? When we look at human unhappiness and we define it as being the uncomfortableness of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, then human happiness is the dissolving of that attitude to how things happen in life. And if that attitude dissolves, and yet there is still, it's the body karma or the person's destiny to find themselves in, a sex scandal or a money scandal or a political scandal, then if their attitude is one of non-doership and non-attachment, but I don't mean an attitude that is just a convenient attitude, but I mean a real attitude of non-doership and non-attachment, where the attitude of doership and attachment has fallen away, then for that person, the one that is maybe at the center of the controversy, there is no guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. So there is happiness. So that, on the one hand, is liberation from suffering. Now, it has to be genuine. It has to be the real deal for there not to be guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So the absence of guilt is not where we have some psychological idea and that says, you know, I'm not the doer, too bad, so sad, you know, you got hurt, who, you know, it's all God's will. It's not, that's more where the understanding is being used as an excuse in a sense, and it's not real understanding. Now, when a sage finds themselves in that situation where there's a scandal and they're asked the question, why did you function like that? Why did you behave like that? They might still find themselves in the role of a teacher and say, well, you asked the question. The real answer is, I found myself in a situation, and that is the way that the body moved. That is the impulses that came up, the decisions that got made in that moment were such that the outcome was what is in front of us now. And the way I see it is I couldn't have acted differently. Now, when that's heard by someone that's been hurt, or even a society that sees that as inappropriate, it's heard as an excuse. It's heard as, oh, that's very convenient. And the truth is, the sage might actually be describing their deep relationship to life. And if the tables were turned where pain was delivered to them, that's the attitude that they would have, that's destiny unfolding. It's not pleasure. It's not what they would choose if they had a choice. But that's what's happened. It's argued that certain immoral, or what are deemed to be immoral acts, are driven by deeply ingrained unresolved issues that still exist in the system. And so from that point of view, someone can argue the understanding isn't total because there are still remnants of doership and attachment to outcome in the system. And that's what's driving the body-mind organism towards pleasure in a way that it can't be controlled, where there's no moral compass that says, no, that's not where to go. And that might be a valid argument, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a fair degree or even a very strong degree of understanding in that person. It doesn't mean that that person isn't a valid teacher. It might mean that their process is not complete. And if it's deemed that their process is not complete, then some people might say, I'm not interested in listening to what they have to say. It could be that their process is complete, but you just don't like their personality or the way they behave. And that's valid also. You say, well, maybe they've got an understanding, but I'm going to find someone I resonate with because I just don't like that behavior. So that's what can happen. And what also can happen is that we find that we do become a better person. We do find that our moral standards get better. We do find that because the attachment to outcome on many levels has been uprooted, that we just simply don't find ourselves drawn to situations that we might have been drawn into previously. That if someone is projecting onto us some fascination or attraction, that we find we don't have a reciprocating urge or desire to fulfill something. And so we find that we don't get drawn into situations that are likely to turn into problematic situations because someone is, the other is trying to get something from a psychological point of view and maybe not doing what's best for them, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer is that we probably do find, or you could, as a general rule, you will find that there is a moral improvement and the person becoming a better person. And what's more important is not to look at that as happiness for the human being. That is, in a way, a byproduct where, on top of the fact that there is no attitudinal suffering, that we find that there is less pain from awkward situations. So that's the best I can, the best I can give you, I'm afraid.
Well, that's a great answer. I needed, that's exactly what I needed to hear. Yeah, thank you. I'm not even going to add anything to that. I was going to ask you one more question, but I know you've got other people. Do you want to answer another question for me or not?
Yeah, go ahead while you're here, and I'll make it the last one unless it's quick.
Okay, thanks, Roger. So when you talk about, so I've been, like you, I've been dabbling in non-dualism. Before I found you, I was dabbling in non-dualism, and it was all about the awareness and the consciousness and all that. So sometimes I get, when you talk about the body-mind as an instrument that the consciousness works through, to me, it becomes like a dualistic thing where all of a sudden you're mixing sort of like mind with matter, because I see the body as an instrument, like a material instrument, and consciousness as a mind thing. So I get very confused about that whole thing and how they, trying to put these two together. It seems very dualistic, and I have a hard time with that. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, the problem comes with the fact that as soon as you create a concept, you tend to have boundaries around the concept. So if you're talking about fruit on the tree, you talk about the fruit and you tend to focus on the fruit and not the rest of the tree. And that can make it sound like the fruit is not part of the tree. Whereas, in fact, that's a consequence of the concept that has created the duality, rather than the situation itself having a duality in it. So concepts by default are dualistic. We try to have, sometimes some teachings that are really about the top-down esoteric will put forward concepts that try to have less duality in them. So in relation to this specific part where you talk about the biological instrument and consciousness, by using the different words, the two words, we've sort of separated biological instrument and consciousness. Whereas in practice, they're not separate. They coexist. So that's why I keep using the word person or human being. So let's not use person. So you could use person, human being, or ego. To me, they're all interchangeable words. But let's use human being. It's probably the least loaded. And say, I am a human being. That's, if someone said, what are you? Who are you? Unless I wanted to answer it from a very specific teaching angle, if I were to answer it from this teaching angle as the general answer, I would say, what I am is Roger, or what I am is a human being with a name, and that name is Roger. And so then the next question might be, okay, so what is a human being? What is a human being? I say, okay, good question, because I said I'm a human being, so let's define what a human being is. And the answer is, a human being, according to the concept in this teaching, is the impersonal consciousness of Source, which now seems like one thing, linked to a body-mind organism, which seems like another thing, functioning through it as personal consciousness, which is another thing. So it seems like three things: Source, body, and personal consciousness. Whereas how we have to look at it is white light, which is consciousness of Source, going through a red filter and coming out the other side as red light. Now, in actuality, even though we talk about white light, red filter, and red light, you see there's no separation between these three things. They all coexist as one combination of white light, red filter, and red light. And you can see that the red light is the combination of the white light and the red filter. If you take the red filter away, you just have white light. And the human being is the final experience, which is the combination of impersonal consciousness, the body, and consciousness. So hopefully we can dissolve the duality in our concept and see what the concept is pointing at, which is the experience you have right now. And the experience you have right now is of consciousness, which is not form. It's the thing which is aware and the thing which feels like it exists. I am. And you can see that consciousness is never independent from the body. It never exists when the body doesn't exist. And especially in daily living, you have the experience of daily living, and the body is part of it. And there is a sense when you touch the body, yes, this is part of who I am, but when you touch the book, it's an external object. If you touch the tree, it's you, what you are, touching another object. So the experience is I am a human being, and a human being is a body with emotions, with thoughts, and especially with consciousness that is the core of the human being. So the body is essentially wrapped around this core of consciousness. And the result of a human being is the personal consciousness experience, which is my daily life experience that is always changing moment after moment. And so that's how I see myself.
Would you say, though, that the body-mind mechanism is made of consciousness? It's all the same. There's no difference in its makeup or its material, let's say. I don't know what the right words for it, but do you know what I mean? It almost seems like we're mixing two different things. Like you talk about it as a mechanism. Isn't it made of consciousness itself or not? Or is it even important to even know this?
Well, it is if someone's playing around with refining that. There's several ways of looking at it. One, it depends what you mean when the word consciousness is used. So we can say all there is consciousness. That's basically Nisargadatta, a summation of Nisargadatta's teaching. In some parts, he says all there is consciousness. Or you can say all there is awareness, which means the book is really made of awareness because it only exists in the presence of awareness, and essentially it's a object of awareness, made of awareness, witnessed by awareness. So theoretically, we could say everything is made of awareness or consciousness. But in practice, that's we might believe it to be our experience, and we might have a sense of it when we become aware of awareness and how everything is interdependent with awareness. There is a sense we could sort of see objects as formless in a way, but we might become convinced that we know the object forms and really miss the fact that on some level, even when we understand it's all dependent on consciousness, it still has form to us. If you touch the book, it still has form, and yet our recognition that everything is awareness can turn into a concept that prevents us from acknowledging the form aspect. A better way of explaining that is to say, okay, we can understand in theory everything is made of energy from a scientific point of view. Instead of using the word awareness or consciousness, we can, an appropriate substitute in principle is energy. It's not a substitute where energy is synonymous for consciousness or awareness, but it's a parallel to basically seeing a building block of form, a lowest common denominator. And so energy on one level on the physical level, let's say, energy is a valid lowest common denominator. So if you come to understand in theory, everything is made of vibrating energy, you might get a sense when you're looking at the book or looking at the tree that it's all vibrating energy. And you could become convinced that you know the tree only as energy. Whereas the truth is, in practice, you know the tree as energy in the form of wood and treeness. So is it valid to say everything is consciousness? Yes, from one perspective, everything is consciousness. What does that mean? Really, another way of saying it, instead of using the word consciousness or awareness, is everything is source. Source is better in a way. It's less descript. It's more generic. It's saying everything comes from a source. We don't know what that source is, but we know that there is this here. So let's just say everything is source. Another less descript word than consciousness is life. Everything is life. The tree is an expression of life. The book is an expression of life. The human being is an expression of life. So ultimately, the lowest common denominator is life of all of the objects. So we're finding a commonality beneath the distinction of form. Because on the surface level, trees are different to cars and cars are different to people. So if we start to find a commonality, then the duality falls away in our understanding, but in practice, it's still there. The difference in form is still there. So life, source, are words that I would prefer to say everything is made of life or source or energy. If someone insists on it being everything is consciousness, then I would say, okay, let's at least say everything is consciousness, but then consciousness can present itself in two different broad expressions of form. Consciousness can present itself as energy, which is on the physical level. So we'll call consciousness as energy. And consciousness can present itself as awareness or consciousness. And so then we've got something in the manifestation that says, okay, all of the form is energy, which is a form of consciousness in energetic form. And there is consciousness in the form of awareness or consciousness functioning through the body. That is this distinction that I think you're alluding to, where you say it's a bit hard because the body is of form and consciousness is not of form. But is it fair to say that the form is consciousness? And so in summation, I could say, if we want to say everything is consciousness to avoid the confusion of what seem like different things, we say, yeah, everything is consciousness, and consciousness as energy and consciousness as consciousness. So the tree is consciousness as energy. The book is consciousness as energy. The body is consciousness in energetic form. And that which functions through consciousness in energetic form, let's say in the body, what it is functioning through it is consciousness in consciousness form. Consciousness as awareness, consciousness as beingness. That might, for some people, give you something to think about.
That's a lot, Roger. That's a lot. But I'll listen back to this. I need to listen back to it a few times. But thank you for that. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, you're welcome. There's so many different ways to look at this, and even the words that are given will be heard and turned into a model of whoever's hearing it in a very unique way. And when someone hears a certain description, the intellect and how it's received will create a model, and then it will feel like, oh, I know what he's saying. And then a year down the track, the model might change and we go, oh, I thought I knew what he's saying, but now I have a new model of what he's saying.
By the way, I wanted to tell you that ever since I've been listening to you that that's been the greatest gift, is that I no longer hang on to concepts as if they're the ultimate truth. I just keep an open mind about everything that I'm hearing and not build images around anything that I hear, because I know that's going to keep me stuck. So I just wait for something to, to clear things up as I go along, like let things be revealed as they will. So that's the greatest gift I've gotten from listening to you. One of them.
That's good. Well, you can create a sort of a conceptual image as long as you don't turn it into a belief. So then you're ready for it to change at any time. Because we do need, in a way, to, if you hear everything is consciousness, you do sort of need to say, what does that mean? And we will come up with a model of what it means to us. But if we understand that exactly what you said, it's all concepts, then that model is ready to change at any moment when a new bit of the puzzle comes in.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Good. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Roger. See you next time.
Yeah. So thanks, everyone. Please drop in next time and we'll answer some more questions, hopefully.